This is about different types of crime scenes and how they can be destroyed and degraded over time. Next week we'll look at the preservation of a crime scene and what particularly the first officer attending a crime scene has to do. So this is mainly about the different types of crime scenes that you get and how they become contaminated and therefore how the evidence becomes less reliable. Now, we've all seen dramas, you've all seen CSI, you've all seen movies where there's been a murder. There was a movie with Al Pacino, I think years ago, Sea of Love, about a murderer. And Al Pacino, I think with the cop, said he hasn't known her very long. And the other cop says, why? And he says, well, look at all the stuff, all the pictures, all the wrestling trophies. We're still at the wonder of me stage. And I thought that was quite good, the wonder of me. You know, everyone tries to impress the other person. So we've all seen the dramatisation of murder scenes. Usually a suspicious death will be treated as murder until they know that it isn't a murder. So the presumption is that a death in suspicious circumstances will be treated as a murder scene. And just in case it turns out to be a murder scene, because if you don't treat it at the start as a murder scene, the evidence will be lost. It's a very unusual scale of resource. I've got a friend who is a police officer, and he was saying that if there's an allegation of a serious sexual assault, like a rape, it's basically 10 grand right away in forensic science and police time before you get to the stage where the prosecutors are making their mind up. So preserving the scene initially and doing all the forensic stuff is basically 10 grand in time. So murder scenes involve significant sums of money. Minor offences are much less expensive in terms of police effort because they put less effort in. Because minor offences are often more easily solved because the person is, less likely to flee. Breaches of the peace on doorsteps, minor assaults, and so on. And also as well as the scale of the seriousness, obviously. And also the police tend not to catch individual burglars, or solve individual burglaries, but they do catch burglars. So it might not be that you'll catch the particular person who committed a burglary, but the police will catch the burglar because, as much as anything else, they'll be informed on by their other drug-using friends and so on for money, and they'll be caught with the property because the person who knows that they committed a burglary and are trying to sell the goods will secure £40 or £50 for themselves. By telling the police who'll turn up and search the place and arrest them. So minor offences don't attract the same level of forensic support because it's a less serious matter, there's less time and money that can be spent, and if people are committing regular breaches of the peace or regular acts of petty criminal damage, they'll probably get caught anyway eventually, and it's cheaper to let them commit the offences and then catch them than it is to try and solve the first one. As it says here, the stakes are generally lower. And they're solved by methods other than forensics. In other words, for example, people often tell you who it was that did it because they recognise them. Offences committed in a local community when someone's drunk, usually there's a witness that can tell you exactly who it was. A given scene can have very different legal consequences. So if someone drives badly, that might not be an offence at all. Or it might be careless driving, it might be reckless driving. They've actually just changed the law, so I should have updated this PowerPoint. It used to be the great distinction was between driving without due care and attention, careless driving and reckless driving. And then above that, you even had racing in the public highway, which is a very serious offence. But a given piece of bad driving could be one of a number of different criminal offences. If it could be more serious, it has to be treated as such initially. So if you're looking at what looks like a piece of bad driving that could be reckless driving, then it has to be treated as reckless driving until a decision is made that it's really careless or driving without due care and attention, or perhaps not an offence at all. So for example, driving that produces a death could be causing death by dangerous driving. So therefore it's going to be treated very seriously until it can be not treated in that way. There's a presumption that it'll be treated as a serious offence. Investigations, of course, produce a lot of inconvenience. So, for example, if you've got a road accident and it's just a civil matter and there's no real reason to think an offence was committed, You can clear the road, you can get the company to tow the cars away, and it's all over. If you close the road, that has massive consequences for everybody and huge economic consequences as well. So investigations produce a lot of inconvenience for everybody, and therefore they can't continue for longer than they need to. For example, if there's a piece of really serious dangerous driving on the M25 motorway, the ring road around London, if you could calculate the real losses, you're talking about tens of millions of pounds if you can't get the motorway open. So a truck driver who seems to have fallen asleep and swerved onto the hard shoulder and taken out a parked car. Quite often people are not paying attention, end up ramming cars on the hard shoulder because they think they're in a lane of traffic. So someone who's done that or seems to have done that, you need to get the motorway running again as quickly as possible. So the whole crime scene needs to be photographed, the data gathered, the evidence gathered and bagged, and then the place opened again. An abandoned house or a church or a motorway, these are all very different things when it comes to inconvenience. An abandoned house can be sealed off for weeks or months, a church for days, a motorway for hours or less than hours. So there's a very different priority in terms of time. You can't close Glasgow. Even for a serious offence like murder, you can't close Glasgow because it imposes too much of a cost on the entire community. It's a bit like, for example, if a player died of a heart attack in the middle of a football game, a lot of people feel the game should stop. It's not obvious that it should, because the amount of the impact on other people in terms of the ground having to be emptied earlier than thought otherwise, and then all of the people whose transport connections have now been disrupted and all the impacts on that, the person's already dead. So if the person's already dead, there's very little good that can be done by just stopping the game and emptying the stadium. It might seem like a symbol of respect, but it doesn't actually achieve anything. And as I say, the closure of Glasgow after every serious offence would impose probably hundreds of millions and maybe even billions on the urban conurbation, central Scotland. Certainly hundreds of millions, if I had to guess. If every time there was a rape, a serious assault, an attempt murder, an assault to permanent injury and disfigurement, a culpable homicide, if you took all the serious offences in Glasgow and closed the area every time one of them happened for, say, a day, probably you'd be looking at hundreds of millions, certainly tens of millions of economic consequences. Queen's Park. They closed Queen's Park in Glasgow when Moira Jones was killed, and the chap they eventually caught was charged with murder. Now, I've posed the question, is this evidence of misinjury? And the reason why I mention that is because if a young man had been beaten to death in the same circumstances, it's not clear to me they would have closed the park for a week. There's lots of culpable homicide involving blunt trauma, kicks and punches, that doesn't result in that kind of resource. Moira Jones was beaten to death over a period of hours, which is a horrific offence, and she was raped. But if a young man had been beaten to death, I wonder whether they would have closed the park for a week. Preserve the scene, as we'll talk about next week, is the golden rule, especially for cops, but also for the public. So don't walk across blood, don't tramp it into carpets, don't kick knives across the street, don't pick things up, don't look in people's pockets. So preserve the scene, try to preserve the evidence. Cops must preserve the scene, the public can preserve the scene, and if you deliberately interfere, that's an offence, quite a serious offence. Much contamination is innocent. Dogs will find bodies. If it wasn't for the presence of dogs in parkland, they wouldn't find it so easy to find bodies. The trouble is that dogs will chew bodies as well. So by the time the owner finds out what it is that Bonzer is having a go at, there'll already be some teeth marks in the body because the dog will give it a chew, probably. Cops, of course, give their DNA for elimination purposes. So if you've committed any serious offences in the past and you think that there might be your DNA might be in the database, you might not want to apply to join the police because they'll check it when they take it. I don't know if that's ever happened actually, but as I say, police DNA is collected for elimination. TV shows unhelpfully educate criminals. It used to be the case you never had bleach at a crime scene. There was a murder in the northeast, I think Bayliston, somewhere like that. There was a murder a few years ago, and Mark Clinton, I seem to remember, was acquitted of it. The murder took place, I think, in some kind of pub restaurant, and I seem to remember there was hair scattered everywhere as a way of destroying or making it much more difficult for the crime scene to be analysed. So the TV shows have educated the criminals about, for example, ultraviolet light and blood spots, or the different kinds of blood spatter that exist, or exactly how DNA is transmitted in low copy DNA. So, as I say, the criminals have learned what the IRA learned a long time ago about forensic science. Most violence, of course, is not murder, and therefore they have to help the injured, they have to contaminate the scene. Even in a murder, it's often not clear that the person is dead, so they might have to contaminate the scene. They certainly will have to contaminate the scene just to check that the person is dead. My pal, the police officer, attended a death, and the whole flat was stinking to high heaven. That was why the neighbours had called. And when he got the door open, the place was full of blue bottles for flies, and the body had essentially started to liquefy, and he couldn't work out. He's a good eyesight. He's a police officer, but he couldn't work out what he was looking at until he realised that the body had liquefied, and the skin, including the flesh and the face, had begun to liquefy down the body. So the face was down and around the neck and the upper chest. So he decided it wasn't necessary to disturb the crime scene. But when it comes to somebody, for example, who's hung themselves, a lot of cops will carry a knife or a protected blade knife, a hook knife, to cut ropes and similar things. And if a body's been hung, probably they're going to have to cut the body down just to check, even if it's obvious. And that involves cutting the rope or the ligature so as to preserve the knot, because there are particular ways that you tie knots if you're tying it yourself compared to somebody else tying it. People will often tie a knot when the rope's already around their neck. And they know which bits of the rope you tend to touch when you do it. You have to preserve the knot. Relatives, of course, commit offences. Lots of people are murdered by somebody they know or are related to. Of course, Cain and Abel, the story of the brothers, is as old as the Bible. So people who are relatives commit offences, and they also produce partial DNA matches. So DNA can be quite complicated, because if you get a partial match and there's a lot of contamination, it's possible for the defence to argue that the reason why the match is there is because the people are cousins, and that would account for a partial DNA match. So family relationships are complicated. And the cops prefer, and the forensic science prefer, if they can match people with females. Lots of people aren't actually related to the person they think is their father. It can be as high as 13%. And therefore, there have been serious criminals convicted of things like rape because their sister has been arrested for a driving offence. And when she gives her DNA, because the X chromosome that she has is the same X chromosome as the man, her brother. So when they run her DNA, they find that he's a partial match for the rape, and therefore they get lifted for that. So relatives, as I say, can commit offences and produce partial DNA matches, and that complicates the picture. Associates, of course, remove and add evidence. So somebody who's trying to help you out will take away the knife or the gun that you used. They might also throw in somebody else's jacket. If you can get your hands on the jacket of a known offender or a local, person in difficulty, a local drug user, if you can get hold of some of their clothing from a homeless shelter and chuck it into a murder scene, they're probably going to get lifted. So the contamination of the crime scene can take place deliberately. People are also just not trying to contaminate the scene, but just, relatives will take things. If someone's wearing a memento, like a gold chain around their neck, and they've been seriously assaulted or killed, relatives will take that as a memento without meaning to contaminate the scene. If you commit suicide, your insurance won't pay out, your life insurance won't pay out. And therefore, people who find a relative who's committed suicide might try to contrive the scene so it looks like a murder, so they can get the insurance money. The motives of people who contaminate crime scenes can be quite complicated. If your husband has committed suicide, there might be £200,000 in it if you can convince others that it's been a murder. and therefore you'll contaminate the scene. People can do various things to contaminate a scene. Some people contaminate scenes stupidly by walking across them because they're drunk and it's outside a nightclub. And of course, the paramedics contaminate the scene by trying to help the person who's been assaulted or whatever, or been murdered. And then, of course, you've got people who maliciously change scenes, people who throw jackets into the crime scene, people who throw a baseball cap through a window into a crime scene in order to try and incriminate somebody else. So people maliciously change crime scenes. Imagine if you could get a bag of rubbish from Berlini. Imagine the value of a bag of crisp wrappers and cans from the rubbish bins in Berlini, because you could really contaminate a crime scene using that. So the police cordon the area and they use their authority to stop people doing this. That you'll always get a cop standing at a crime scene to stop people coming near it, because they know that folk will try and do things. The most obvious thing you can do to try and contaminate a crime scene is to start a fire, and it might be the easiest thing to do as well. So the police, as I say, will use their authority, use cordons to try and stop this. The cold, right? Suppose for the sake of argument, you get a murder on a freezing cold winter's night, and it's cold, bitterly cold, all the next day. That will typically be less of a problem when it comes to contaminating a crime scene than heat. High humidity and sunlight. There's an old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sunlight is really powerful. It's full of ultraviolet light and it disinfects things, it kills things. COVID, for example, coronavirus dies very quickly in hot, humid environments, which is why Thailand and Vietnam have very low levels of COVID. So if you've got a roasting hot summer's day with high humidity, the air is full of water, that'll tend to kill nearly everything. The rain, of course, washes things away. And it dilutes samples as well. So even if it doesn't wash it completely away, it dilutes it to the point where it can't be analysed. Anything organic, in other words, anything that involves bodies, like blood and hair and so on, will be contaminated or washed away by rain. A tint on the key area. You've often seen this in murder scenes and so on. They put a little tint to preserve the scene. And they'll do everything they possibly can to take pictures and analyse things, put the victim's hands inside poly bags so they can preserve what's under their nails in case they've scratched the person or they've touched the person. So they try and do as much of that as possible, particularly if there's a threat from the weather. If you've got a body lying at the bottom of a slope in a park and there's any risk of rain, you've got a major problem, because there's absolutely nothing you can do, or very little you can do, to avoid either contaminating the scene massively by trying to prevent the water running down the hill, or by allowing the scene to be contaminated by the water running down the hill. So it can be very difficult. So they try and grab the evidence as quickly as they possibly can. I'll show you a tape, which you might have seen on the Angelica Crook murder in the city centre, the body in the church. And I thought it would take longer to take the evidence from her. It was about 2 or 3 hours, I think, under the floorboards with the forensic scientists before they could move her body. So when you arrive on a crime scene, you think, what if it rains? You could check the weather forecast, obviously, but you have to consider the possibility of that kind of contamination. So what if it rains? What can be done right now to solve the problem if it rains? And tents are the most obvious. Umbrellas as well. The bagging things as well. If you've got something like a knife and you picture it, you take a photograph of it where it is, you can then usually put it in a forensics bag and it'll be removed later on and checked. So there are ways of lifting things. You've seen this in the movies when someone puts a pen up the barrel of a gun in order to avoid touching anything else. And you might have seen some of the old cop shows where nobody uses the phone because the police will want to actually check the phone, and the phone will be the thing that the criminal used without thinking about it. So and also the cops really try to think the way the criminal did when it comes to touching everything on the scene. So for example, if a person's been murdered or assaulted, and there's you've got to put your hand in something to get out. In other words, there's a wall or a fence or anything like that, or in allotments, for example, or in gardens, there's a gate. The cops are thinking, you must have touched that gate. If the gate is on the latch, if it's actually been properly closed when they arrive, they've got very good reason to think that you probably opened it and then closed it on the way out. So they'll be thinking you touched that without realising. So they think, what if it rains? Bad practice will result in the conviction of the innocent, the acquittal of the guilty, and the public disengaging it. So if the cops don't preserve crime scenes properly, then what you'll get is people who should have been convicted will walk free because the evidence will be challenged in court, and the guilty will walk free, and the innocent might be convicted. Forensic science will often prove that somebody couldn't have done an offence, and this is one of the things that people miss. The forensic science now is so good that fitting people up is much more difficult. If you've got a lot of rapes in an area and somebody gets fitted up by the police, then in the past the only thing you had to worry about was the rapes continuing. And the rapes might not continue because the person who's the rapist might stop because they think if they stop then or move somewhere else they won't be convicted. So the fitting up of people in the past, the Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four, and so on, the bombers, the accused IRA bombers, these people would be much harder to fit up now. So, for example, the woman Jill Dando, the presenter, the guy that got convicted, Barry George, he was convicted because he had a tiny fragment of what could have been fireworks or what could have been nitrocellulose from a gunpowder in his pocket. And that kind of forensic science these days is much more sophisticated. So it's likely that people who would have been convicted in the past will be acquitted now. We always concentrate on the people who are caught because of the science, but a lot of people are acquitted because of the science. They're eliminated at an early stage because of the science. Of course, canny offenders can approach the locus, the place where the crime was committed, by the cop route. In other words, if you think, once you know how the cops think, you can think like that as well. So if you look at a path that leads up to the back window of a warehouse where you would break in, and there's an obvious path, the last thing you do is you walk up that path, because the cops are going to assume that you walked up that path and they'll take a different route to get there. So once you know how they think, which is they think offenders are lazy, they think that if there's an easy way to get into a place, the offender will have taken it. So, for example, they'll assume that if it's difficult to lift a window by the top, but it's easy to lift it by the bottom, then they're going to find your fingerprints all along the bottom and your DNA along the bottom. They're not going to think that you went to the trouble of getting high with a piece of wood and pushing it from the top. They'll assume that you were lazy and lifted it from the bottom. So once you start thinking about how the cops think, you can then do the opposite of what they would have assumed. Deliberate contamination to confuse the issue is becoming more of a problem. As I say, people throwing hair around, people taking property from others and then depositing it in the crime scene. Of course, a lot of people who are committing routine offences are familiar with folk who are also in the same difficult circumstances. As I've said before, folk in homeless shelters, the Salvation Army place down on the Clyde used to have lots and lots of guys who'd been in trouble with the police. My pal, I met him one day, was trying to enforce a warrant in there. He couldn't get the guy that he wanted, who were running in and out of other rooms and avoiding the police and treating it as a great game of chasey. So if you're in somewhere like a Salvation Army centre, it'd be very easy for you to obtain property that you could use to put other people in a difficult position. Once you had a mind to do it, you'd be watching. If somebody routinely eats a toffee crisp in the evening in the TV room, it'd be the easiest thing in the world for you to pick up a couple of them before you did something and then land them in it. So evidence has to be secured and then kept secure. There used to be a problem in the past with police evidence rooms. There should be a cop that's responsible for the evidence room and nobody else should have access to it, because things used to happen, like, for example, drugs going missing once they've been put in the evidence room. Or, for example, if you wanted to contaminate videotape of a police misconduct, you stick a dirty great big magnet in the box with the tapes. And that means you don't remove the tapes, but you destroy all the evidence because it corrupts all the tapes. So evidence has to be secured and then kept secure. Check his wallet is a common mistake. Someone's been assaulted and you don't know who they are, so what you do is you put your hand in the pocket and pull the wallet out in order to look for their ID. Now, of course, as soon as you put your hand in the pocket, then you've rubbed all your DNA all over the inside of the pocket, and you've then, of course, touched everything in the wallet as well. So you should avoid putting your hands in people's pockets. After everything's been secured, there's one final search, especially under the things that the authorities brought. So, for example, the edges of the tent that they put around the body. When you put the tent down, it's going to have an absolutely perfect place where it sits. It's extremely unlikely that you really carefully looked at that place where it was going. Imagine the difficulty involved in lowering a whole tent. So you put the tent down, and then when you lift it up, of course, that area under the edge of the tent, the aluminium poles, that'll be exactly the place where you covered something when you put it down. So the things that the cops brought with them, like for example, tripods that cameras sat on, or tables that they used to put things on, anything like that is going to be checked, because the legs of a tripod or the legs of a table or the edge of a tent is going to push things further into the grass or into the mud. And therefore you check under the edges of the things that you brought in. And of course things stick as well. So you might have picked something up. The example I always give is a contact lens. People get involved in fights and their contact lenses get knocked out. If there's a contact lens under the edge of something, it's not going to be seen very easily, and it'll have stuck under the edge of the table or the chair. Imagine if you're the suspected offender and you wear a -3.25 plus 0.75 astigmatism left contact lens, and such a thing is found at the scene. That's a damn hard thing for you to explain, isn't it? You've got a motive, and a contact lens that is 1 in 1,000 is found at the scene. You're getting convicted. A final debrief for everybody. Give them an opportunity if their memory's jogged. Are you absolutely certain that was what you saw? Think it through carefully again. When you arrived, are you absolutely certain there wasn't somebody else there? Look at the pictures now we've got of the scene. Are you certain there wasn't another car there when you arrived? And so on. So a final opportunity, a final debrief before the scene's released back into the hands of the people that own it. The park becomes once again part of Glasgow's parks or whatever. You have to dispose and destroy the outer personal protective equipment, and you take a note of the fact this was done. Because if you don't, what happens is that you then take all the evidence from that crime scene to the next thing you attend. So the cops have to take all the paper suits and all the overboots and all of the gloves, because otherwise they'll move all the evidence from one place to the next. So all of that has to be destroyed, and a note taken of the fact that it was destroyed. Prints or pictures of cops' shoes are sometimes a problem. If you kick a door wearing shoes, you'll typically leave a print on it. If you climb over a counter wearing training shoes, you'll leave a print on it which is very distinctive. So you want to be able to show that here are the shoes of the people that were on the scene, and here's the print that was taken from the counter and also found just inside the door. So you want to be able to show that you didn't bring in this print. So taking a picture of who actually, what people were wearing who were at the scene can be very useful, because you can prove that the particular training shoe, which can be, as I say, very distinctive. When people walk, just like driving a car, they wear the sole of the shoe. I'm a very heavy heel striker. So I strike on the outside of the heel and then again in the middle of the shoe. So I wear the centre of the shoe right through by twisting when I walk, and I wear the outside edge, and it's very distinctive. Some people have got a neutral foot strike, so they land on the whole of the foot. I don't. I heel strike and then twist. So I wreck my training shoes in a particular way, and again they can use that as very strong evidence where the print came from. So the normal personal protective equipment is an oversuit with a hood and overboots and double gloves. Double gloves so that when you touch something, you can take that outer layer off and put another layer on. So if you touch something that's very frequently touched, like for example a handle, you dispose of those gloves once you've turned the handle and then put another one on, and a mask. Your hands, of course, are endlessly used and easily injured. If you cut your finger and you contaminate the scene with blood, that's bad news, obviously. Respirators have to be used for some things like fentanyl. The George Floyd death, Floyd died not because Chauvin had his knee on his neck. He died mainly because he was being held face down. It's called positional asphyxia. Positional asphyxia means that you're overweight and the contents of your stomach are being forced up into your chest cavity, and that stops you breathing. Now, the particular problem for Floyd was he was being pressed into the ground by the other cops, but also as well he'd taken fentanyl. which is really powerful opiate, like heroin, only synthetic and very powerful. And that suppresses your breathing anyway. So if cops are handling fentanyl, or so-called super fentanyl, which is like 100 times more powerful and used by veterinary surgeons to drop things like elephants in Cape Buffalo, and if you're handling stuff like that, you have to wear full respirators to avoid dying basically from inhaling it. You replace outer gloves after touching things like handles, as I said before, any kinds of switches, any kinds of cupboard doors in kitchens, anything like that which is going to be touched a lot, you replace the gloves. You have to rigorously clean anything that can't be disposed of, like, for example, the tripod for a camera. Tripod for a camera is hundreds of pounds. You're not going to throw it away every single time. So all of that has to be very thoroughly cleaned, or better still, cover it in something which you can then dispense with. So you cover it with a clean plastic bag and tape it in place, and then you burn that with the rest of the personal protective equipment when you leave. Rather than, because once you've got mud and things in a complex surface, the only way you can really clean it is by autoclaving it. Autoclaving it means baking it at quite a high temperature in a controlled environment. Dentists have to autoclave a lot of the stuff they use, and that's the only way you can clean something that's got a very complex shape. Now, the cops carry the essential stuff, the basic stuff, the paper suit and the gloves and so on. They carry it in the response cars, so they can put it on immediately if they have to. The lock-card exchange rule, this is a famous rule. Every contact leaves a trace. So every single time you touch something, you leave a trace. You've got DNA in your sweat, on the palms of your hands, in your skin, and your cells. So you leave a trace. It's impossible. You're leaking huge amounts of information all the time. Crime scenes are a fading picture. As time passes, it rains, it gets sunny, organic material degrades, so the picture fades. You want to try and grab the evidence as early as possible.